A thin coil of smoke can be easier to trace through time than a single manuscript. It slips into creases of memory that paper misses. It carries scent, heat, and a small, catastrophic clarity. Follow that thread, and you find people, farmers, shamans, prisoners, poets, soldiers, inventing, arguing over, refining, and fearing a practice that is at once intimate and public, the deliberate inhalation of the aromas and compounds of cannabis. Unlocking when societies began to smoke weed is less a single date than a braided timeline, where technology, ritual, trade, and taste meet and reshape one another. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Picture a cold dawn on the steppe. The grass is silver with hoarfrost, and the sky is a clean, hard blue. A band of riders has dismounted beside low, smoke-blackened tents. In one tent, small braziers are packed with embers and green plant matter, the air already heavy with a resinous, pine-tinged perfume. Men take turns lifting crude felt coverings and leaning in, not to eat, not to sip, but to breathe. Their eyes water, they cough. Laughter follows. A leader rises, wipes his hands on his leggings, and says, in a voice that will be retold by traveling merchants and foreigners, "This clears the head and frightens bad dreams." Whether he used the same words is unknown. The effect, so contemporary it startles the modern ear, is plausible. Those steppe scenes are no modern invention. Ancient travelers and later archaeologists have pointed to nomadic peoples, often called Scythians in the Greco-Roman imagination, who gathered around heated vessels and inhaled vapors from plants, explicitly to alter perception or sanctify a moment. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, gave an account of garlands, braziers, and the inhalation of vapors during funerary rites. Centuries later, in the frozen graves of the Altai and Tarim regions, archaeologists unearthed remains and objects that add muscle to the story. Iron censers, traces of combustion, and cannabis remnants suggestive of ritual use. The picture emerging is a culture of inhalation already ancient by the time city-states were building temples in Mesopotamia. Shift westward and a different origin opens, one that begins not with burning but with cultivation. In the lost soils of the Yellow River Basin, ancestors of later Chinese civilizations cultivated hemp for fibers and seeds perhaps as early as the Neolithic. It was useful: rope, cloth, sail. For millennia, the plant's economic face overshadowed any medicinal or psychoactive uses. Yet, texts later attributed to legendary herbalists mention a plant that comforts, that eases, that can be used in healing. These references do not read exactly like a manual for smoking, because inhalation as a delivery method is only half the story. The transition from chewing, brewing, and topical use to the controlled practice of inhalation requires particular technologies: braziers, pipes, methods of packing and controlling heat. And those innovations arrive at different times, in different places, in different social packages. The first clear physical suggestion that people inhaled cannabis rather than consumed it by mouth comes from Central Asia's cold, dry graves. charred seeds and fibers in burial chests, and, in some cases, stone vessels arranged in the pattern of burners. Analysts who sampled organic residues found traces that point to inhalation practices, which could be either ritual or mundane. Dates attached to these finds often sit in the first millennium BCE, with many clustered around the early Iron Age. The plausibility of ritual inhalation in those contexts lines up well with textual fragments and classical accounts relaying that nomads used vapors to ceremonially cleanse and to vent grief. It's impossible to know how steady the practice was, whether each community adopted it, or whether such scenes were intermittent, seasonal, idiosyncratic. But even intermittent ritual use is a profound cultural fingerprint. Inhalation had been discovered as a reliable way to alter mood and unify people. Move south and the plant wears another face. In India, hemp becomes woven into the fabric of spiritual life. Sacred texts and later commentaries refer to preparations with intoxicating qualities. The name bhang appears in medieval and early modern sources, attached to a drink made from cannabis leaves and milk, used in festivals and devotional rites. The way bhang appears in the record suggests a slow accretion of uses, from culinary and medicinal preparation to ritual sacralization. Smoking in the Indian subcontinent, in forms later associated with the chillum and the long clay pipe, praised in Sufi and ascetic circles, surfaces in accounts from the medieval period onward. Those pipes, ceramic, clay, occasionally metal, offer a technology that funnels smoke, shapes communal practice, and rapidly changes the social meaning of inhalation. A chillum shared across palms makes the act social, contagious, a ritual of fellowship as much of transcendence. The Middle East produces yet another scene, the rise of hashish, a concentrated resinous product extracted from the plant's flowering tops. Arabic language sources use the word hashish from the medieval centuries onward. By the time of the later medieval period, Mamluk Cairo has travelers' accounts suggesting the presence of hashish users among soldiers and urban types. Chronicles describe anxiety more than instruction, moral panic and political alarm at the possibility of large numbers of men sedated in the public square. Hashish travels as a commodity and as an idea, carried along trade routes to North Africa, where Moroccan preparations later become emblematic of the substance in European imagination. There is an essential difference between chewing or brewing cannabis and smoking it. Inhalation delivers compounds rapidly to the nervous system. It produces an immediacy that favors spectacle and ritual. There is a reason why incense became central to worship across cultures, and why, when cities and courts grew, inhalation would be reinterpreted as theater. Smoke can both reveal and conceal. It carries scent and promises of the other world, while making it easy for authorities to police visibility and presence. Europe's relationship with cannabis is oddly ambivalent. For a long time, the plant's principal role was utilitarian: rope, sails, coarse cloth. Hemp fields dominated landscapes because ships would not sail without rope. The psychoactive uses of the plant, when they appear in medieval European records, are often marginal. References to ointments and potions in herbal manuscripts, or to folk practices in villages. The European smoking tradition that most people imagine, rolls of herb passed hand to hand, does not become common until after the Columbian Exchange.
Tobacco arrives from the Americas in the 16th century and changes the technological vocabulary of smoking. Once pipes and inhalation become ubiquitous for one plant, they are more easily adapted for another. Cannabis, for a while, is a latecomer to the smoking table in Europe, though hashish, introduced via travelers or soldiers who had seen it in North Africa or the Ottoman world, begins to attract attention among curious elites. That moment of elite fascination crystallizes in Paris in the first half of the 19th century. In the salons and curiosity clubs of the city, physicians and writers experiment with hashish as a chemical mirror into the mind. Jacques-Joseph Moreau, a French psychiatrist, wrote about the mental effects of hashish and convened informal circles where artists and poets, Baudelaire and others among them, sampled its effects in a pursuit part philosophical, part recreational. These gatherings did not invent smoking, but did import a new language of exploration to Europe. The resulting cultural cross-pollination, half scientific, half performative, is crucial. Smoking moves from the margins into a lab and into literature. The hashish clubs produce an account of intoxication that is both clinical and romantic. They set a precedent for the later ways that Western modernity would try to domesticate, measure, and often stigmatize inhalation practices. Across oceans, indigenous Americans had their own long history of smoking, but primarily with tobacco, not cannabis, until the plant was later introduced. Native pipes are among the oldest smoking technologies in the Americas. Calumets and other forms were used in ritual contexts, treaty-making, and funerary practices. The arrival of Europeans changed the botanical map. New plants, new trades, and new prohibitions.
By the 19th and 20th centuries, global trade networks carried not only plants, but ideas about their proper use and their moral valence. If there is a second great moment in the history of smoking cannabis, it is the 20th century's political whirl. Colonial encounters, migration, urbanization, the consolidation of modern states, and the rise of pharmaceutical and prohibitionist logics. Cannabis travel into metropolitan centers of Europe and North America often follows migration routes. North African laborers to Marseille, Caribbean migrants to London and New York, bringing with them practices that are quickly recoded by anxieties about race, class, and control. Laws do not arise in a vacuum. Criminalization is an act of reputation management. When a substance becomes associated in the popular imagination and in policy with foreignness and disorder, the response is often legal suppression. The 20th century saga of cannabis criminalization in many Western countries is as much about policing bodies and borders as about the pharmacology of a plant. That is the structural sweep. But a timeline uncloaks itself more vividly when we follow particular people. Consider a young Scythian rider, unnamed in chronicles, who sits by a brazier in winter and breathes in cannabis smoke as part of a funeral. The action ties him to a tribe and to a set of values. Communion with the dead, the assertion of courage, the marking of a liminal moment through shared sensation. Or take an acolyte in a medieval Indian monastery, whose hand trembles as he offers a small cup of spiced bhang to a visiting pilgrim. The drink is both hospitality and sacrament. Or imagine a Parisian physician measuring the effects of hashish on his own nervous system, pen poised like a confession. These scenes are not meant to be documentary exact. The voices inside them are given plausible motives and textures, but they translate the larger historical facts into lived experience. Across this braided story, technology keeps returning as a decisive factor. Smoking is never just about the plant.
It depends on how heat is controlled, on the shape of a pipe, or the invention of paper leaves, on the availability of a resinous concentrate. Once thin papers and inexpensive filters appear, or when a culture adapts a cheap metal pipe, the scale of inhalation can change. What had been a rare sacrament can become an everyday habit. Consider the paper rolling into a joint. Suddenly, smoking is mobile, private, and cheap. It moves into alleyways and living rooms. Conversely, the communal chillum or shared hookah encourages ritualized exchange and social bonding. Technology channels social practice. A complementary driver is taste and symbolism. In many societies, the scent of smoke is coded. Incense in a temple announces sanctity. Smoke from bread baking signals domestic order.
Cannabis smoke could carry the opposite symbolism: dissolution, diversion, escape, or the same sacral connotations, depending on context. In the Sufi circles and in some ascetic traditions, the loss of ordinary self through intoxication was sometimes framed as a path to divine union. In other settings, it was framed as a vice to be policed. Those symbolic frames affect who is allowed to smoke and who is condemned for doing so. Consider methods of social control. A magistrate who sees smoke curling in a public square can interpret it as disorder. Taxes and curfews become tools of regulation. But the substance itself resists being locked down entirely. It slips through funerary rites and into taverns, from caravans to court, from yarn spinners to poets. Along the way, the plant's uses proliferate, as fiber, as oil, as medicine, as a sacrament, as a recreational indulgence. That polysemy, many meanings for one plant, helps explain why smoking did not emerge in a single burst, but in multiple, overlapping moments. A pattern emerges. Inhalation practices appear earliest in regions where people both cultivated hemp and developed the technologies for controlling combustion or vapor. In the dry climates of Central Asia, the conditions preserve evidence better than in humid zones, and we get clearer archaeological signals. The earliest solid evidence for deliberate inhalation of cannabis in forms that resemble smoking or vaporization clusters in the broad heartlands of Eurasia during the first millennium BCE. Yet that is not the origin story for the plant's human use. Hemp cultivation in China reaches much earlier, and ritual or medicinal uses in India and other places likely predate the surviving archaeological traces of smoking. The act of smoking, then, is a late chapter in a longer story of human-plant coevolution. The political and moral framings that arrive with modern states are crucial to any contemporary timeline. Once the machinery of centralized power, forensic science, and media emerges, societies invent narratives about drugs that reflect anxieties unrelated to pharmacology. Urban decay, youth rebellion, imperial control. Smoking, which by virtue of its visible smoke and its social spread invites public scrutiny, becomes an ideal target for regulation. In the colonial metropole, cannabis came to be coded as the substance of the colonized. In metropolitan centers, the same plant became a symbol of counterculture. The 20th century is where the simple act of inhaling a plant transmutes into a contested site of identity. But the story is not only repression.
It is also about creativity and adaptation. When smokers encounter prohibition, they develop new languages and techniques, a slang, ritual forms of cigarette rolling, methods of concealment.
When poets discover hashish, they write new metaphors. When doctors in the 19th century describe hashish psychoses, psychiatrists invent categories that will have consequences for treatment and policy. Today's medical cannabis debates are continuity as well as rupture. New studies, new patient narratives, and a booming industry reframe old practices in contemporary terms. If we fast forward toward the present, the technology of inhalation continues to mutate. The 20th century joint and bong age finds new cousins in vaporizers and cartridges, technologies that are part chemistry, part industrial design. Those devices change dosage, privacy, and stigma. But technology alone does not explain adoption. Cultural acceptability, legal frameworks, and commercial channels are equally important. Where a society conceives of cannabis as medicine, smoking becomes therapy in a clinical frame. Where it is seen as deviance, smoking becomes a criminal act and a marker of social exclusion. So, what is the earliest date when society began smoking weed? The honest answer is twofold. If we mean people intentionally inhaled vapors from cannabis as a cultural practice, the earliest reliable archaeological and textual signals point to Eurasian steppe and adjacent regions in the first millennium BCE. Aligned with nomadic funerary practices and later chronicled by classical authors. If we broaden the definition to include any human use of the plant, then the timeline stretches back several millennia earlier to Neolithic hemp cultivation for fiber and food in China, and to medicinal or ritual uses in South and Central Asia that predate the act of inhalation. Smoking, in the specific sense of controlled inhalation for psychoactive effect, is a late but repeated innovation across many cultures. It may be helpful to think of smoking as an emergent property, like a technology that arises when certain needs, tastes, and tools coincide. A plant with psychoactive potential exists for thousands of years. People experiment with its teas and balms. A culture invents a brazier that concentrates vapors. A ritual context normalizes the inhalation and lends it meaning. In another place, a pipe technology appears because of tobacco, and so cannabis, when introduced, fits neatly into a smoking repertoire. Across these convergences, smoking emerges, diffuses, morphs, and sometimes vanishes, only to re-emerge later under different names. The human side of the timeline matters, because the same plant elicits similar cultural responses across widely separated societies: suspicion, sacredness, commerce, desire. The early steppe rider who bends over a brazier, and the Parisian poet who tastes hashish in a velvet salon, are separated by centuries and climate, but their experiences radiate the same human questions. Why do we seek altered consciousness? How do we ritualize pleasure? Who gets to decide what counts as medicine and what counts as madness? There are surprising intersections, too. The ritual use of cannabis in funerary rites resonates with the medieval European ubiquity of smoke in liturgy. Incense and cannabis are both means of making absence tangible. The communal chillum in an Indian shrine echoes the communal bong in a 20th century protest square. Both are devices for turning private sensation into public solidarity. Where law attempts to separate the public from the private, communities find new rituals to keep the practice alive. It would be simplistic to narrate the history of smoking cannabis purely as a march toward modern ubiquity. There are reversals, local extinctions, and reinventions. In some regions, the practice was rare or absent. In others, it remained a perpetual sacrament. What changes is not merely the fact of smoking, but the way societies interpret and regulate it. In some moments, smoking is an emblem of elite cosmopolitanism. In others, it is a marker of criminality. The plant's ambiguity makes it a mirror of social anxieties about control, pleasure, and otherness. Take one more vignette before we move into the smoking rooms of modernity. Imagine a coastal North African town in the 17th century. Fishermen haul nets swollen with silver fish. The market is loud and saffron-scented. Cardinals of colored cloth mark faction allegiances. In a narrow alley, a cluster of men sit around a low brazier, passing round a small ceramic pipe. They speak in rapid, neighborly tongues about bread prices and the last harvest. The smoke curls not as sacrament, but as an ordinary companion to gossip. The scene suggests a crucial point. Once smoking becomes routinized, it migrates from the temple to the tavern, from ceremony to the quotidian. That migration shapes later social policy decisions. A practice that was once sacred becomes profane in the eyes of some observers, and that shift makes it governable. The timeline of smoking cannabis is therefore not just a set of dates. It's a narrative of migrations, of plants, people, and practices, and of inventions, of pipes, papers, and pharmacologies. It is also a story of reputations, of how societies judge certain pleasures and anchor those judgments in law, in medicine, and in moral discourse. If you trace the smoke out of the tent into the wind, you also trace patterns of authority, intimacy, and exchange. What the archaeological record cannot tell us, the literary and administrative records sometimes can. Chronicles and travelers' tales show the anxieties and fascinations that smoke provoked. Reports from merchants note hashish in caravan encampments. Legal pronouncements set fines and exile for use in public spaces. Those documents rarely offer impartial science. They are instruments of a society naming and dealing with the unknown. For example, a 16th century magistrate's edict forbidding certain forms of intoxication is as informative as an archaeological brazier. It tells us that by then a practice had achieved visibility sufficient to provoke regulation. And yet, for all the sources, for all the braziers and edicts, doubts remain. We cannot always distinguish a ritual fumigation for scent from an intoxication ritual. We struggle to assign motives to anonymous actors. We must live with a history that is often probabilistic, layered in rumor, and mediated by the agendas of the literate. The charm of studying the history of smoking, therefore, is not in closing the book on origins, but in mapping the patterns, where smoke appears and what societies do to contain it. As we head deeper into the modern age, the timeline accelerates. The 19th and 20th centuries compress centuries of practice into decades of global debate. Medical endorsements, recreational booms, institutional prohibition, countercultural revival, and finally, in some countries, legal reappraisal.
Each shift produces new technologies and new rituals. The steam of a nomadic brazier and the hiss of a modern vaporizer are linked. Both transport compounds into lungs. Both produce altered states. Both are evaluated by law and culture. In the next section, I will take you into 3 close scenes that illuminate these transitions with specific people and objects. A Tarim mummy and his braziers, a Parisian club where hashish enters literature, and a 20th century urban corner where migrants remap smoking into a new social geography. Those vignettes will show how technology, ritual, commerce, and law braided into the living practice we call smoking. They will also reveal that the timeline is not a line, but a tapestry, and that smoke, for all its elusiveness, leaves a pattern we can begin to read. The first vignette begins where the desert keeps its dead like treasures, dry, cold, and stubbornly patient. In a low mound at the edge of the Tarim Basin, a body lay folded upon layers of felt and reed mats, its linen wrappings stained a slow brown, its hair braided and glinting with copper thread ornaments. The chamber had been sealed by wind and salt. When the archaeologists pried it open, they found not only a man, but a small house of his belongings, a bow whose sinew had not entirely rotted, a wooden comb, fragments of painted cloth, and, set near his shoulder as if he had reached for it in sleep, a shallow bronze brazier. The brazier was no mere hearth. Its rim bore the blackened film of repeated burnings. Inside, among the fine dust and mineralized ash, were fragments of dried stems and a resinous detritus that smelled faintly of bitter green when a gloved hand lifted them into the cold air. The plant fragments were remarkably well preserved in the basin's climate. Microscopic analysis, undertaken decades later, found glandular hairs and chemical markers consistent with the cannabis plant.
Chemical assays identified terpenes and cannabinoids, compounds that, even in attenuated form, hinted at an intention beyond rope-making or fiber. The assemblage suggested that the brazier had been used to heat and vaporize, to exhale smoke within a small private architecture of sensation. The image is arresting. A man in the 4th century BCE, his cheeks sunken, his hands folded, a little brazier kneaded into the corpse's goods as though it were an instrument of passage. But the find resists easy moralization. In the Tarim context, the plant was many things at once: material, medicine, aromatic. Textiles preserved nearby bore traces of dyes and oils. The man's garments had been repaired with care, his social status ambiguous, though not low. The brazier's placement could indicate ritual. It could mean pharmacology. It could mean simply that the scent of the plant was his preferred accompaniment in life, and therefore in death. The archaeologist's categories, ritual, medicinal, utilitarian, strain when confronted with the braided materiality of everyday choices. What the tomb offers, beyond the romanticism of ancient drug use, is a material continuity. The brazier in the Tarim grave is the ancestor of later devices that mediate the same human impulse: to alter perception, to mark moments, to create shared temporalities. The brazier is small and portable. Its metal skin carries heat, and its chamber, like a mouth, transforms plant into plume. In other contexts, other hands would invent related implements: the water pipe at a caravanserai, the clay pipe beside an Ottoman hookah,
The stiff paper and tobacco leaves folded in a 17th-century Dutch traveler's satchel. The Tarim brazier testifies to the principle. The technology of smoking rarely emerges de novo. It mutates through tinkering, compromise, and local needs. Brazier to bowl, to pipe, to vaporizer, each form reshaping the social logic of use. Beyond the artifact itself, the Tarim case allows us to read the social uses of plant compounds in an age when medical and legal categories did not yet demand segregation. Healers and householders likely moved freely between pharmacopoeia and ritual. A bowl of smoke could be an apotropaic scent at dawn, an analgesic for a fevered body, or a stimulant before a hunt. The archaeological record thus suggests that control, if it existed at all, was local and fractal. A family elder might insist on a certain mixture. A caravan captain might forbid its use at night for safety. A local priest might allow it for purification. Authority at the margins is rarely absolute. It weaves with custom. The Tarim man's brazier also prompts a reflection on commodity. By the first millennium BCE, the plant that would later be categorized as cannabis had already become portable value, easy to dry, store, and trade across Eurasian corridors. Traders passed more than cloth and salt. They moved smells and habits.
That mobility meant that when societies later reached for regulatory instruments, edicts, fines, ecclesiastical censures, they were attempting to govern a practice not of static invention, but of migratory exchange. The archaeologist can describe the object. The historian must then trace the social lines it cut across. From the frozen grave, we move to the warm, lamp-lit rooms of 19th-century Paris, where smoke took on new aesthetic inflections rather than only practical uses. The salon and the club, the two theaters of Parisian sociability, were places where objects and habits imported from empire and caravan routes arrived enriched and reinterpreted. There, in a low-ceilinged club whose walls were hung with Orientalist prints and carpets, a particular communal experiment was staged. A host prepared a bowl of dawamask, a paste of resin and spices mixed with tobacco or hashish, dissolving it in a teaspoon of warm water, adding rosewater and perhaps a spice or two. The paste was portioned into tiny cups or placed upon a hot pebble. Conversants passed the cups, and the talk flowed in turns. The club's members prided themselves on the discipline of the encounter. The experiment was to subject one's imagination to a regimen, to chart the contours of altered perception with the steadiness of an observant mind. Poets sat elbow to elbow with physicians, and the conversation ranged from anatomy to metaphors for light. A nargileh bubbled in the room's corner, its glass globe catching lamplight. A tray of sugar and coffee steamed near the door. The smoke in such salons was not simply a private vice. It was an aesthetic medium, a way of instantiating sensation, of staging the mind's exhibition. The effect on literature was immediate and twofold. On the one hand, the hashish salons fed imaginistic catalogues, the Baroque sequences, the synesthetic metaphors, the elongated similes of inner voyage. Writers experimented with lexical compression and dislocation that would later be recognized as precursors to symbolist technique. On the other hand, the very existence of the salon as a site of debatable respectability made the use of such substances a signifier. To smoke in that circle meant to be in touch with cosmopolitan currents.
to stand at an aesthetic frontier that bridged Europe and the Orient of the imagination. The practice was an emblem of elite curiosity. Yet even in Paris, the practice provoked contest. Newspapers and physicians produced early clinical accounts of poisonings and mania, and the nascent press, hungry for scandal, amplified anecdote into moral panic. Those voices introduced new frames, public health and social order. At stake was not merely bodily risk, but reputational economy. The salon that treated hashish as artistic provocation did so at the cost of opening a discursive space in which the behavior could be categorized as dissolute.
Thus, the plant's reputation began to split along social axes. In one register, it was a stimulant of genius. In another, it was a sign of degeneracy. These emergent taxonomies would soon make the jump from pamphlets to policy. Between the ivory towers of Parisian aesthetics and the dry tomb of the Tarim Basin lies a terrain of commerce and legal imagination. The French colonial apparatus was already attentive to intoxicants in North Africa and the Levant. Colonial administrators watched with a mixture of concern and opportunism as local practices entered metropolitan salons. The colonized subject's habit became, in the metropolitan imagination, both evidence of exotic otherness and a potential instrument in colonial governance. By the late 19th century, metropolitan anxieties about the contagion of Oriental habits contributed to calls for regulation, calls that were rarely neutral, as they entwined with racialized conceptions of civility. The Parisian room thus functioned as a crucible where taste, empire, and the classificatory power met. The last vignette moves us into the 20th century's urban corners, into the geography of migration, the policing of bodies. Post-war port cities, those gateways of people, freight, and rumor, offered new crucibles for the plant's social life. Migrant communities arrived carrying tastes and techniques. Hashish rolled into cigarette papers, the method of blending resin with tobacco, the skill of hand-rolling a joint while trading news. These practices found new affordances in dense urban streets where room was scarce and kinship networks dense. Imagine a corner shop in a dockside neighborhood in the 1960s. The proprietor, who earlier sold sugar and small wares, now keeps cellophane packets and hand-rolled cigarettes under a lamp. Children flock to the doorway for bread. Elders gather to talk about work permits and back-home happenings. In the afternoons, a constellation of men clusters on the curb. Porters, seamstresses on break, fishermen with calloused hands. Language mixes: Arabic, Creole, Punjabi, Patois, the local tongue folded into new cadences. They pass around a small paper cigarette, not in ostentatious consumption, but as an economy of intimacy. Shared smoke that lubricates conversation and reassures kinship in a place that can be inhospitable. The urban corner is itself a technology of social support. In the workplace, the migrants are isolated. In the corner, they register belonging. The act of passing smoke consolidates trust. It signals membership in networks that offer jobs, a place to sleep after a late shift, a route out of loneliness. The plant in this context is not only an intoxicant,
It is a social protocol for sustaining migrant life. But city streets are also sites of state attention.
As post-war governments moved to formalize policing and the regulation of vice, smoking practices became more visible and more liable to criminalization, especially when those practices were performed by racialized migrants. The corner, therefore, becomes the object of municipal gazes, orders to disperse, occasional raids, police notes on public nuisance. The criminal law refracts pre-existing moral judgments and attaches to them new penalties. What had been a ritualized practice of solidarity becomes, under a different regime of power, evidence used in deportation hearings or in casual stops that escalate to arrests. The transformation is double-edged. On one side, the criminal law imposes scarcity and danger, which in turn fuels black markets and entrepreneurial adaptations. Dealers who fold the product more discreetly. Storefronts that double as social centers and commodity nodes. The invention of packaging and branding that resists easy detection. On the other side, criminalization produces cultural meaning. Smoking becomes coded as deviant in the wider society, and through media representations, it becomes a shorthand for urban disorder. That shorthand is rarely neutral. It maps onto race, poverty, and the distribution of social capital. Yet the migrant's corner also demonstrates resilience and creativity. Rituals adapt. Where earlier communal bowls and braziers gave way to paper and small glass pipes, new rituals emerge. Tea poured in small glasses while the smoke does its social work. Prayers whispered at the periphery of the circle. A lullaby-like cadence to the exchange of news. Younger generations fold local musical idioms into the practice. Reggae bass lines in a basement, rap verses spun on a street corner. These cultural fusions re-territorialize the plant. It becomes a part of urban aesthetics, clothing, music, language, transforming its stigma into cultural capital in some subcultural spaces, even as official regimes continue to criminalize it. Across these three scenes, Tarim, Paris, the urban corner, the continuities are striking. The same plant travels, adapts, and persists. It moves in caravans and by air freight, in the pockets of migrants and in the pages of journals. The technologies that carry it, brazier, pipe, paper, vaporizer, are not neutral. They shape the duration and scale of intoxication, the intimacy of the encounter, and the visibility to outsiders. Rituals of sharing and ceremonial uses reappear in new forms whenever communities seek to bind themselves together in uncertain worlds. Law and medicine, too, follow a pattern. In early contexts, regulation is ad hoc, local, tied to custom. In the Parisian moment, medicine and moral critique begin to articulate broader anxieties about modernity, which find expression in press accounts and clinical case reports. In the 20th century, the modern state elaborates institutions that can remove practice from the realm of private ritual and place it under surveillance and sanction. Each shift in authority reworks the practice's social meaning: sacred, elite, profane, criminal. Yet none of those shifts eradicate the plant's capacity to serve as a medium of social life. These vignettes also reveal the political economies of taste and control. Cosmopolitan consumption in elite salons can sanitize and aestheticize a practice. Criminalization often racializes it. Commerce rides both waves. Luxury connoisseurship and illicit markets are twin outcomes of the plant's portability. The same chemical that seduced a Tarim mourner's brazier could, centuries later, be sold in a Parisian patisserie as part of exotic confection, or repackaged in a dockside kiosk as cheap escape. The plant mingles economic logics with moral ones, and those mixtures are never stable. Finally, the textures of material culture insist on a modest truth. Objects matter. The shape of a pipe, the size of a brazier, the porosity of paper. Each affects not only the pharmacology, but the social choreography. The brazier demands small groups huddled around shared heat. The paper invites solitary rolling as well as street-level sharing. The vaporizer offers discretion. The hookah enacts a leisurely communal duration. Technologies of inhalation therefore mediate intimacy and exposure, affecting who may participate and under what terms. In every age, the device is an index of style, access, and risk. If one draws a line through these histories, it is not a smooth arrow of progress, but a braided cord of contingencies, materials, networks, languages of value. The Tarim brazier, the Parisian salon, and the migrant corner are nodes on that cord, each illuminating a different logic of use: right, aesthetic experiment, social survival. Together, they suggest why the plant's reputation is so volatile and why public responses range from celebration to prohibition, often within a single lifetime. From these scenes, the story broadens into policy debates and cultural arguments that will occupy the 20th and 21st centuries. The medicalization of cannabinoids, the advent of industrial smokables, global treaties and their local discontents, the rise of a commercial legal market alongside enduring black markets. But before moving to laws and markets in abstract, it is necessary to linger with the people who breathed the smoke. The brazier keeper at dawn, the poet at a velvet table, the porter on a rainy quay, and to ask how their practices survive, adapt, and resist. Their choices, small and embodied, accumulate into the larger social patterns that historians and policymakers later attempt to name. In that sense, the story of smoking is less about a single origin than about repeated reinvention of devices, of rituals, of meanings. Each reinvention maps onto changes in power, economy, and intimacy. To read the plant's history is thus to read the history of human connection under constraint, the little economies people build to soften hardship, to celebrate, to mourn, to think, to share. The brazier in the Tarim grave, the bowl in the Paris club, the cigarette in the port corner, these are not merely instruments of ingestion. They are loci of belonging. It is here, at the convergence of object and social life, that the modern debates take a different cast. Public health statistics and policy papers speak in aggregates. They cannot hear the crackle of resin or the exact smell of rosewater. But policies aim to shape precisely those everyday practices. The tension between statistical abstraction and sensory particularity will drive the next phase of the narrative: how states attempt to redesign social life around pharmacopoeia, and how communities respond through adaptation, concealment, or public claim-making. And so the tale of smoke continues, braided with commerce, ritual, and law, each thread tugging at the others, revealing both deep continuities and startling transformations.
The small objects survive: a brazier's curve, a pipe's mouth, the fold of a paper. They carry with them not just plant material, but the history of the people who used them. That history, uneven and often contested, points toward the difficult political questions ahead. Whose practices will be normalized? Whose will be punished? And how will new technologies and economic systems reorder ancient rituals of sharing? The answers will not arrive from a single source. They will emerge from the dense, often noisy conversations between users, physicians, merchants, and magistrates. Conversations that are, in their own way, as old as the first brazier's smoke. The brazier keeper's morning begins long before law books are opened. He wakes while the wind still smells of frost, and the town is a string of low, smoke-stained roofs. His hands know the weight of coal, and the little ritual of coaxing ember from kindling. He tends the vessel as much for the heat it gives the clay bowl, as for the steadiness it grants the small circle of men who come to trade gossip and bread. When magistrates, physicians, and statisticians later set about measuring consumption, they will count units, ages, and disease incidents. They will not count the pause between one man's exhale and the other's reply, nor the way the brazier's low glow allows a confession to land more lightly. Those qualities resist tabulation, yet they shape risk and resilience just as surely as dose-response curves. In the velvet gloom of the salon, the poet frames such resistance as style. He arranges his papers, laces his tea with rosewater, and watches smoke curl like thought. For him, the implement is an aesthetic choice, its brass mouthpiece a punctuation, its ashtray a prop. When cigarettes become products of mass manufacture, that punctuation must compete with branding. Marketing translates intangibles, freedom, modernity, rebellion, into graphic identity. The poet sees this and sighs. The image flattens the gesture without eliminating longing. Even as technology standardizes inhalation, people rework the practice, borrowing the machinery of commerce to keep older forms of intimacy alive. On the quay, the porter learns to make the smallest transactions serve many ends. A handoff of wrapped paper is also an economy of trust, a favor promised, a debt remembered, a comfort transported under rain. Criminalization and border controls will transform that economy. Where once a clandestine exchange was part of a neighborhood choreography, policing turns it into risk, and risk rewrites choreography into codes and glances. Some practices retreat into more private devices, vapor pens, concealable cartridges, precisely because the material form of consumption becomes a matter of survival. These trajectories, ritual, aesthetics, survival, met with 20th century science and 20th century politics in ways both banal and profound. Medical investigation separated compounds from smoke, isolating molecules and their effects. Clinicians and labs translated centuries of embodied knowledge into trials, charts, and therapeutic narratives. Simultaneously, industrial production industrialized inhalation. Mechanized rolling, uniform filters, and global supply chains compressed habit into rhythm. Lawmakers, responding to epidemiology and international pacts, sought to reshape social life by regulating devices and substances rather than simply persuading hearts. What followed was never uniform. In some places, medicalization offered new status to users, a patient rather than a criminal. In others, prohibition hardened into markets run by those excluded from licit commerce. Where legalization opened commerce, it often created winners who could play by regulatory rules, capitalized firms, branded retailers, while many of the everyday users who had sustained older practices found themselves marginalized or repurposed as nostalgia acts in curated spaces. Technology kept changing the terms. Each new device rearranged privacy, duration, and accessibility, prompting fresh cycles of invention and adaptation. If one looks closely, policy debates are arguments about objects as much as they are about ethics. What kinds of pipes will the law permit? What standards of manufacture will be enforced? Which shared rituals will be recognized? Which will be criminalized? The numbers that occupy reports only become meaningful when situated against the brazier's curve, the hookah's bowl, the vaporizer's discreet hum. To govern inhalation is therefore to govern intimacy. Who may gather, how they may speak, and what forms of solace are legitimate. The consequences reach into markets and hospitals, into taverns and family rooms, and into the quiet calculus of survival on a rain-slick quay.
These are the tensions that follow the objects forward. A brokered meeting between public health and daily life, in which neither side fully grasps the other's instruments. Histories of law and commerce must be read alongside the small economies of use if one hopes to understand why some practices endure beneath prohibition and why others change form to thrive within new legal worlds. The next movement of the story turns to those brokered meetings. Treaties signed in conference halls, regulations drafted in ministries, entrepreneurs and patients negotiating the seams, and to the embodiments that continue to refuse easy categorization.